Morning. I've been doing this for about 10 years now. Very early on in the piece, in fact in the first year, I made contact with Wendy Slee. We became friends and we've shared a lot of Thylacine information over the years. Wendy was kind enough to introduce me to a few people in Nannup, and we launched our documentary in Nannup in 2017, so we've had a good friendship over the years, and I've learned a lot about thylacines, not only through Wendy, but through a lot of the people in WA as well, because there's been so many sightings. Wendy's dad, Sid Slee, put out this great little book back in the 1980s, I think it was, or the 90s, might have been the 90s by the time he published it, but during the 70s and 80s, he and Kevin Cameron and Sid's son Ian actually did a lot of research in WA. Kevin got fantastic photos. He got heckled by the scientific community because the photos weren't absolute, because it was just the rear of the animal digging at the base of a tree. A whole lot of stuff went down. Anyway, a lot of the evidence that Sid sent in to the Department of Fisheries and Game back in the day disappeared into the ether and was never seen or heard of again. Which is very typical when it comes to this sort of stuff. Anyway, over the years there's been many close calls that we've had with thylacine evidence. I've had my own DNA evidence that was just ignored basically in 2017 with a scat that I found in Tasmania. There's been numerous videos, photos. We have these really similar footprints, identical footprints basically, that come from all over Australia. With the big fifth digit hanging off to the side. We've got a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest these animals aren't extinct. The sightings information alone is testable as scientific evidence if someone bothers to do that. Anyway, over the years, like I said, we've come very close to proving this. Now, in early last year, 2023, I was contacted by Wendy in regards to a story that she'd heard through a friend of hers, who used to be a park ranger, or is still a park ranger, I'm not certain. But anyway, in 2016 a fellow was fishing along a river in WA. It got very windy, there was a storm, a tree blew over. At the base of the tree was a small skeleton, and he went over and it got his curiosity and he picked it up, and he ended up taking it to the University of Western Australia to be identified. Now, remember, this was 2016, 8 years ago. It came back as being a juvenile thylacine and less than 20 years old, basically, after they'd examined it. They offered him a substantial amount of money for the skeleton, and he declined, and they actually gave it back to him. Now, the fellow happens to be an Indigenous man from the eastern states, but he lives in WA. And because he's an Indigenous fella and he thought of doing the right thing by the local Indigenous community, he offered it to them to be the caretakers of this very significant physical thylacine evidence of mainland existence, and also a very culturally significant animal to the people of that area, because they have it in their culture as a living animal to this day. And they actually have the physical proof of that. Now, I haven't been fortunate enough to see it myself, but Wendy's been kind enough to provide me with a photograph of the jawbone with a scale next to it to show you that it is actually quite small and it is a juvenile jawbone. So, with all of this, for the last 18 months, we've been sitting on this information and trying to get a situation happening where we may even be able to go forward with the physical evidence, but that hasn't been able to happen. But I have permission from Wendy, and she has permission from the traditional owners of the area that have the animal in their care, the skeleton in their care, that we can talk about it. So we're going to talk about it. I don't expect the media to jump on this, because the media are in love with trying to clone an animal that's clearly not extinct at the moment, and I don't expect them to really be interested in this story. But this animal does exist. This is less than 30 years old basically, this little skeleton. They didn't have the skull, they only had the lower jawbone and the rest of the skeleton, but it was verified by the University of WA to be a juvenile thylacine and less than 20 years old in 2016. So there you have your proof of breeding once again, because Dr. Archer had proof of breeding with his juvenile humerus that he found in a cave deposit in the early 70s that he said was no more than 80 years old, even though he still says the thylacine became extinct on the mainland at least 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, which is a strange contradiction in itself. Anyway, the thylacine is officially extinct according to the experts, but there are thousands and thousands of witnesses all over Australia and in Tasmania that would argue that, me being one of them. So I'm going to now read you an addition to Sid's book that Wendy penned last year, and she kindly sent that to me, and we may or may not get that published one day in Sid's book for Wendy. If we could maybe raise the money to do that, that would be great, and that would be the fitting finish for Sid's book, which clearly indicated in all directions that we had thylacines in WA at the time of publishing of this book. They haven't gone away. We've had some very good footage. We've had some, pretty obvious rumours sort of confirmed from a witness whose father worked for Parks and Wildlife back in the 70s. This is a cover-up of grand proportions. I'm just going to say it. It's so obvious to me and many other people this animal exists on mainland Australia. So anyway, I'm going to read you now Wendy's new edition for her book, for her father's book, that we hope to get sorted one day, and if not, you'll have a record of it now anyway, and you'll hear completely from Wendy's perspective her side of the story regarding the thylacine, her father, her family, Kevin Cameron, and all the other people that have been involved over the years, and just how much connection she has to the family farm where they saw these animals in the past, and to the Indigenous people who are now the custodians of this very, very special little baby Thylacine Joey skeleton. So I hope you enjoy it. I'm happy to answer a few questions in the comments below, but this is it. We really do have thylacines on the mainland. Hope you enjoy it. Cheers. So this will be the additional chapter to Sid Slee's book, The Haunt of the Marsupial Wolf, and this is by Wendy Slee. And we'll just let this car pass. I live in the house I grew up in, a house built by grandparents who arrived here from Britain as part of a group settlement scheme for the southwest of Western Australia over 100 years ago. My father also spent his childhood in this house, and there are so many stories enshrined within these old walls from generations of our family. One such story, so compelling and enduring, shadowed my father's footsteps throughout his 86 years on this land, and has now become part of my own, and subsequently that of my children. This is a story steeped in intrigue, controversy and speculation, with a subject so fragile and at risk that at times it seemed wiser to keep it hidden and to not speak of it. Yet ironically, this subject, the most remarkable of creatures to ever wander this country, has never allowed us to forget nor to ignore its presence, as if seeking our attention, or dare I say it, urging us to share its story and walk beside it in the most subtle and respectful way. We grew up with the knowledge of the tiger dwelling in the forest behind our home. As a child, it was the source of imagined nightmares, a mysterious carnivorous striped wolf who moved in the shadows. But that fear, laced with hesitant curiosity, eventually turned into fascination and a compelling need to learn more. My father's frequent sightings and descriptions, as well as ongoing regular documented incidents over the years, left us in no doubt that the thylacine was alive and well and living on mainland Australia, as opposed to the general narrative
that the last living Tasmanian tiger died captive in a Hobart Zoo in 1936. As often as the experts would deny the existence of this fascinating marsupial or shut down any such discussion, there would be yet more reports of sightings by locals and visitors to this region, by far outweighing the hollow words of those who would have us believe otherwise. These valid, genuine sightings confirmed all that my father had told us and had himself written about. The details shared from people who did not know my father or what he had learned supported every detail that we had learned firsthand for ourselves. The power of anecdotal evidence. And while no completely convincing photographic evidence has ever been produced, the sheer number of credible witnesses has left us in no doubt that this creature still walks the corridors of the southwest, as it has obviously done right across this country for thousands of years, and more importantly, that it is alive and well. That's the part excites me most. The thylacine is alive and hopefully doing well. My life story has proven this, and while it still exists now, my greatest concern is for its well-being, and the unsettling question as to why the experts in their field don't feel that same concern or fascination as I, and so many others like me do. Although it was many years before I saw my first thylacine, I never doubted my father. He was an honourable, hard-working man whose love of the land and a fascination for nature, weather and geology was backed up by a lifetime of careful observation and first-hand experience. It was not book learning, but lessons from life and studying all that was going on around him, hour by hour, day by day, year by year, that built up his knowledge of natural history and life facts. At the time he first met a thylacine, he had no idea of the story he was about to embark on with this animal. In those early years, trapping kangaroos for their hides was a necessary way of earning some money, especially in an era when times were tough and making a living from the land was the only option for survival. One morning, while checking his snares, he made an unexpected discovery. It was a strange, tragic creature caught in a kangaroo snare, a large, lanky, dog-like quadruped with an elongated tail, very dark in colour, almost black. He was surprised at the size of it from nose to tip of tail. He recalls it appearing to be as similar length to the gap between the fence posts where he had set the snare. As a young boy, it was a creature totally different to anything he had ever seen, and although there was nothing he could do but to leave its body in the bush, it would have been a long horse ride into town and no one to really care or tell about this strange animal anyway. He never forgot. So began his walk with thylacines. And really, with the life he had before him and the presence of these animals in his world, he was never allowed to forget. His discovery set him on a mission to learn more about this animal. Over his lifetime, he would be faced with them countless times. The nature of his work here on the farm, firstly helping his settler parents to carve out a farm in wild, untouched areas of Australian native bushland, then being a dairy farmer, getting up before the sun, caring for land and herds, working late after sunset. He had daily opportunities to witness the marsupial wolf coming and going. Every morning before dawn he would be out in the paddock and bush, bringing in the cows for the first milking, and often would see the tiger, as it became known to the family, wandering, hunting. Every evening at dusk he would be out and about feeding out hay or moving cattle, and would often be in the right place at the right time. Not all animals he saw were black or dark-coloured. Some were tan or camel-coloured, and not all had visible stripes either. Although sightings were sporadic and unpredictable, they served to keep his inquiring mind and sense of wonder engaged. Over 80 years he built up a wealth of knowledge of them and their habits. He was captivated by them and drawn to them. You could well say this creature captured his heart and was indeed his spirit animal. I've never forgotten how he described the effect they had on him. That prickling of hairs on the neck and goosebumps on his skin. He spoke of his experiences while out in the bush working, how at times he would get this strange sensation and know he was being watched. He said that if he quietly scanned around him, he would sometimes see one just watching him. The telltale hairs on the back of the neck sensation is one he often mentioned, and I have heard others mention it too when recalling a sighting. I imagine the awareness of something so utterly unknown and mysterious, like some ancient creature emerging from a doorway to the past, would elicit such an involuntary response. The stories of this animal haunted me as a child, and would fill my mind with unfounded terror, especially when we were younger and had to go outside at night to the backyard toilet, or to get water from the rain tank. How many times did I drag my younger sister out of bed to go with me and stand watch outside in the all-engulfing darkness of the Australian bush, broken by the calls of unseen wild things, most likely birds and insects. The unknown would become a reality larger than life, a terrifying one. If my feet or mind paused long enough, it would charge in and overwhelm my imagination, this silent knowing that something lurking and carnivorous was out there. For many years, this animal was larger than life for us kids. But although one failed to materialise, snarling at our garden fence, never did I doubt my father. He taught us so much about our natural environment, all of which was valid and true. And he instilled in me a resounding curiosity, respect, and love for nature. Over his lifetime, Dad faced a lot of ridicule, denial, and ignorance, and more than the usual doses of bureaucratic lies and bullshit, but he never allowed that to deter him from what he knew to be true. His little book, The Haunt of the Marsupial Wolf, was his response to all the negativity and his way of setting the record straight. It was for him, the conversation he wanted to have, when no one in official positions would have it with him. His book became the dialogue. My father was honest and wise and inspiring, and yes, I am incredibly privileged and proud to be Sid Slee's daughter. In the years before I left home to work in the city and be married and start my own family, there were many incidents that captured our attention. Dad and my brother tried many ways to trap a tiger. How I wish we'd had trail cams back then. Using big walk-in enclosures with a trapdoor and baited with freshly killed kangaroos. One night, Dad came home with a kangaroo he had shot in the back of a small box trailer and left it parked outside our house in the driveway, ready to be taken to the trap in the early hours of the morning before milking the cows. But at dawn, he went out to find the kangaroo had been dragged up and over the sides out of the trailer and was laying in the driveway with its head chewed off. This was within meters of the bedroom windows. I recall that same carcass sat in our freezer, well wrapped, I might add, for a while until someone could take it to the museum for an analysis. However, as the story goes, the carcass did disappear or was lost before any results could be provided. There were several instances of wounds on a kill with strange hairs stuck on them that were sent to authorities for analysis, but again, these always ended up being misplaced or lost. Not once did Dad receive a genuine response to his questions. It was always a firm and resounding, "This animal is extinct and does not live on mainland Australia." That it existed on mainland Australia has never been in doubt though. Stories told on cave walls by the traditional people of many regions here in WA and in most other parts of Australia depict the striped dog-like animals. Oral stories passed down speak of the wild dogs. Further evidence is the skeletons found in our local cave networks of both the Thylacine and the Thylacine marsupial line, and these bones are now preserved and on display at the museum and in the cave interpretive centres. While I was working in Perth, I would drive home most weekends. You can't take country out of the girl, no matter how immersed in the city she is. I'd often bring city friends home with me for a weekend on the farm. I was so proud of where I lived and my family life. One such friend, a young woman called Debbie, was completely new to country or farm living, and after sharing the joys of feeding calves and herding cattle and riding my horse, evening brought the opportunity for me to show her the face of the bush at night. We borrowed a spotlight and set off in my little car following the track that formed the boundary to the farm. I hoped to catch some kangaroos or foxes in the light. We were on our way home down the main track. I was watching the road ahead but holding the spotlight out of my driver's side window. Suddenly she yelled, "Stop! There's a mountain lion!" And I stopped the car and reversed to a gateway into the farm paddock where, as you can imagine, there was nothing. She was wide-eyed and white-faced and said, "I saw a big mountain lion." And she went on to describe it as camel-coloured, large as a big dog, and with glowing blue eyes in the light. We scanned the area with the spotlight, hearts pounding, but seeing nothing, began to drive on. Suddenly, a rabbit ran across the road in front of the car and we both screamed. I think by that point our imaginations and heart rates had blown out of control. But her sighting was in a place where Dad and me in more recent times have evidence of the thylacine walking. I could not believe that my city dweller friend on her first trip to the farm had seen this animal for herself, and I had missed out. But that seems to be the nature of its elusive reveals. During the 1980s, my brother Ian and Dad teamed up with Kevin Cameron and tried for a long time to gather evidence of the thylacine's existence with his help. While I was no longer living here at the farm, I was visiting many times a week, so was still privy to a lot of what was going on. The gatherings around the kitchen table over a cup of tea and home-baked cake, a daily ritual prior to getting the cows in for their evening milking or following a midday's work, held many enthralling discussions. I believe Kevin, with his wealth of knowledge as a bushman, professional tracker, he had worked for the CIB in this capacity as well as the Ag Department, and his Aboriginal heritage, was the perfect person to enlist to help with this. He had an innate connection to the land and the creatures of it and could read signs and vibrations that most people would miss. Over this time, he and his family also became friends with Dad, my brother, and the family, and would spend many weekends here on the farm. I have some distant but good memories of those weekends and the camaraderie between our families, as well as those conversations about the thylacine, which were, of course, so very interesting. Over the years, footprints were the main physical evidence my family had used as proof of the animal's presence. That, of course, and the sight of kangaroos with their heads chewed off. I will comment to put that subject into perspective. Our farm and the local forest have always been inhabited by foxes, usually in large numbers, but they have never killed and eaten a kangaroo, or sheep for that matter, in this way. If they did, it would therefore be a very regular and common sight, because foxes are widespread and wander the paddocks here all the time. Opportunistic little creatures. But these type of kill displays are not common and usually would only occur at certain times of the year. They would often be paired with footprints. Kevin assisted and taught my brother to take plaster casts of thylacine prints, and they produced many of these over their time shared. So, everyone is fascinated by and love to debate the Kevin Cameron photos. Most are quick to call them fakes. I will be equally as quick to say they are not. I recall when they were taken back in the 1980s. Kevin had several dogs that were trained as trackers and used in his work with the CIB. These dogs, Sam and Lobo, were family to Kevin. They lived and worked with him and were part of Kevin's work with detectives in human searches. Here in the southwest, Kevin, Sam and Lobo often went out into the forests of the Witcher Ranges, following trails, and would return with stories of the dogs disturbing or bailing up a thylacine. One particular sighting that I remember hearing about with great excitement was when his dogs had one they'd followed and driven up onto a fallen log. They held it there until Kevin appeared, and he watched as it looked down, hissing angrily at them. Kevin had to call the dogs off before it ran away. Again, it was regrettable that on these instances, and in those days in general, cameras were not something people carried with them. And regardless of the talk from some that Kevin had shot a thylacine for a staged photo, he never carried a gun on any of these expeditions. My family even joked about how frustrating it was to see the animal but not be able to get proof, but when asked if desperate enough for proof, would you kill one, the answer was always no. They would never shoot one if they had the chance, even if they had the chance, no matter how badly they wanted to prove its existence with a physical body. It just seemed counter to everything they were striving for, to bring to light that this animal was living in the southwest. The photos that did generate the most debate were the two where a thylacine could be seen eating something in the hollow of a tree. I can recall the conversation once again around the afternoon tea table at the farm over what had transpired. Kevin had again gone out to where there had been tracks and a sighting. He had placed a freshly killed kangaroo in the hollow of a tree where there was sand that would hold any prints should an animal approach the carcass. He had doused his own body in something animal. I recall it was rupoo or something similar, a method he knew as an Aboriginal man to disguise the human scent while hunting. He then hid behind some logs, this time with a small point-and-shoot camera, and waited. This took incredible patience, as I was told he was there for hours, remaining still and silent. Eventually, a thylacine came along to the carcass of the kangaroo and began to eat, and Kevin took the first photo. Upon the click of the camera, the creature bolted away. Kevin waited, eventually falling asleep. He was awoken hours later by the sound of the animal again pulling at the kangaroo carcass, and managed to take a second photo, again with the animal being startled and running away. These were photos on film, so he was unable to see what he had taken until the film was developed. The two images looked similar, as the animal had been in the same position both times. He leaned out of his hiding place and took the photos, and he had obviously been taking the shots from the same place. But the light was different, given how many hours had passed, and the shadows were very different between the two images, as the second shot was taken later in the day. There was a third photo where Kevin had snapped a shot as an animal looked back out of the bushes at him, but the camera had focused on the fronds of the balga and foliage in the foreground, leaving the animal's face blurry, indistinct, and obviously out of focus. As a photographer, I understand this and can only imagine the sheer frustration of that chance being blown like that. I've seen this photo several times and find with a bit of a squint you can see the shape of the animal's face looking back, a distinctive shape that is like no other animal in the bush. One of the most interesting aspects of thylacine spotting is the unique reaction that people have. Experiencing it myself on every single occasion where I have observed one, I call it the brain scramble. Because until you have witnessed this animal many times, there is basically nothing in your known experience to compare or recognize or reconcile it with, and quite simply, your brain has no idea what on earth you have just seen. My first real sighting in the early 1990s was a perfect example of this. I was driving home from Perth, normally a 3-hour drive, but in this case it was following over 24 hours of travel, having just flown into Australia from a trip to the USA. It was in the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m, and as I headed south of Bunbury, the highway was deserted. Suddenly, this large striped animal bounded across the road in front of me from the bush on the west to the scrub on the eastern side of the highway. I slowed the car, but my brain was racing. Thoughts along the lines of, it's a badger. I'd seen many of these striped creatures killed on highways in California during my travels in the week prior. No, I'm in Australia now, and it's too big. It's a striped tabby cat. No, it's way too big, and has a dog-like snout. Not feline at all. It's a dog. No, it has stripes, and it's bounding like a cat. It's a fox. No, foxes don't have stripes. It's way too big, and that long tail, that long tail. Holy shit, I think I just saw a thylacine. By which stage I was a kilometre down the road and wide awake and in shock, and it was too late to take another look. In retrospect, I feel I have on several occasions seen thylacines, but my brain has neatly filed these sightings into known descriptions of regular animals. I remember one morning in the early 80s driving to work, and not far from our farm adjacent to a swampy area, the nearest farmhouse a mile or more up the road, I saw what I thought was a dog with two puppies on the side of the road. I was running late for work and never really thought any more of it as these dogs ducked quickly back into the scrub. But really, as I reflected later, there were no wild dogs around here, and I cannot imagine that a domestic dog with young pups would be wandering country roads and acting so furtively. Plus, in hindsight, the location where I saw these animals had become a known hotspot with countless sightings over decades, both via my father's records and subsequent conversations I've had with other locals. This animal has a way of tricking the mind in many ways, as there is yet another characteristic of it that would convince most people they have seen a kangaroo. I have often pondered seeing the countless bodies of roadkill along our forest highways that, given the similarity of kangaroos and thylacines, that perhaps some have been killed on the road, but the tragic sight of a mangled body with a long tail and gangly hind legs does not invite further investigation, but could quite easily not be a kangaroo, but only mistaken for one. A fascinating fact that my father taught me about the thylacines he had seen was their ability to stand up on their hind legs like a kangaroo and to use their hind legs and strong tail in the same manner as a kangaroo, to hop, especially in situations where they were startled and had to get away quickly. Dad witnessed them hop like this for several metres before dropping back to all fours and loping away once they had gained momentum. A most interesting sighting that was reported to me a few years ago was from a young German backpacker who was part of a forest defender group camping out in the bush at Nannup, near a southwest wildlife sanctuary. One of the local crews suggested he call me to share what he had seen. He had been with an indigenous man trekking carefully through the bush in search of endangered orchids or plants, in the hope of finding something rare that might help to halt the devastating logging activity planned in that area. The irony is that his sighting was of an animal whose presence, if proven, would indeed put a halt to any industrial activities in the native forest. Yet such a report without photographic proof would have been treated with suspicion or contempt, as if he had conveniently fabricated it, given that he and his friends were admittedly there in the hope of protecting the forest. So he never bothered to formally register the sighting, but it was his description and the fact that he'd not heard of the thylacine prior to this that indicated how genuine his report was. He told me they had been walking in a section of the forest, looking down and scanning for orchids, when he heard a noise and saw what he thought was another kangaroo sitting up in the scrub a short distance away, watching them as they walked slowly through the undergrowth. And he watched this kangaroo begin to hop away on its hind legs. Nothing surprising really, until it dropped down to all fours and loped off like a big cat. That was when he knew he'd seen something very strange, a creature that was certainly not a kangaroo. Once you have seen one of these creatures and gone through the process of what the hell did I just see, you take away a few impressions that will be useful in future sightings or identification. The movement of the thylacine is a major characteristic. My first sighting all those years ago on a lonely highway was so unexpected and brief, but the impression of its action was an animal loping in huge bounds across the road. Years later, I would watch several snippets of footage from trail cams that I had set, or in some of the fascinating footage captured by others, and realised the movement did not fit the characteristic of any known animal and was uniquely thylacine. Some of my subsequent sightings in recent years have been of an animal that caught my attention for the very reason that its movement was this same distinctive, almost ungainly gait. It has reminded me of a horse cantering or an up and down rocking gait that looks quite awkward, but there were also cat-like elements to the loping gait as the animal sped up. Speaking of recent sightings in our family, we almost have an unspoken joke, those who have seen a thyla and those who have not. The have-nots are never impressed when yet another sighting occurs, and they missed out. My daughter Maya is one of the most charmed members of the Thylacine Club, it would seem. In 2015, she had her first sighting. She was with me and her brother in the car, and we still laugh about it to this day. We were on our way home from a music event around 8 p.m. one evening and heading east. There was no other traffic on the road as I slowed the car down to turn into the farm driveway on the right. Ahead, over the hills, towards Nannup, the full moon was rising, and it was a beautiful sight. In fact, it dominated the night landscape. As I turned the corner onto our farm driveway, my mind was all about taking a photo. So I was rolling to a halt and reaching for my camera bag under the passenger seat. My head turned. My son was sitting in the front seat, had Metallica playing loudly on the car stereo, and was more than likely looking at his phone screen. May was in the back seat yelling at me. I could not hear, and so fumbling with my camera, I turned to Sol, saying, "Stop the music," and then looked over my shoulder at Maya in the back seat. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, and she was pointing furiously past my face, saying, "Mum, there is a thylacine right in front of the car." Of course, our heads spun so fast, but by the time we turned and looked onto the driveway where the headlights were lighting up the bitumen and gravel shoulders ahead of us, where we should have been looking all along if not for full moons and phone screens and cameras, there was nothing there. Dare I say it, that at this point I could not have been more disappointed in myself until I then remembered that the dash cam I had purchased with just such rare and long-for sightings in mind was still sitting on my kitchen table because I had not yet bothered to install it. May's description was most compelling, coming from a young teenager who'd only ever been on the periphery of tiger stories, especially as all the main conversations and activity around this animal on our farm and in our family had been before she was born. She described the creature as standing right in front of the vehicle, side on to the car, but looking right at us, or should I say at her. She noted it was about the size of a medium dog and had a weird-shaped head, stripes and a long stiff tail, but her comments on the eyes were the most intriguing. She said she could not look away. The eyes were like these huge dark spaces that drew her in. She could not stop looking at them. She even commented that she wanted to look into them forever. In her attempt to convey how she felt, she said they reminded her of E.T.'s eyes. She certainly had a glimpse into something mysterious and otherworldly. I had my car window down by this point and was holding the camera ready, just praying the animal was still nearby. I asked Maya how it had moved away. Did it bound off the road or did it slink away? She said it just seemed to disappear. She could not recall it moving. It was just there and then it was gone. This elusive marsupial strikes again. Roll on to 2019 and Maya was sitting outside on the front veranda of our house mid-afternoon. It was a warm, sunny day and she was looking across the paddock and hill to the east while talking on her phone. I was inside. Suddenly she came in the door calling, "Mum, there's a thylacine out there." And of course I laughed thinking she was joking. That was the last thing I expected to hear, but I grabbed the first camera I could see once I realised she was not pranking me and dashed outside. She said she had noticed what she thought was at first a fox or dog-like animal coming down the hill and crawling under a fence beside the old dairy. It ambled across the paddock almost in its own little world, but suddenly became aware of her gaze and ducked down behind clumps of tall grass, occasionally bobbing up to look back at her. By the time I went outside, the animal was racing back and forth across the 20-acre paddock, a bit thwarted by fences, and I was trying like crazy to get my camera to follow and focus on it. But as I grabbed a heavy DSLR, it was not really set ready for action photos. A phone camera or video would have been a far better choice, and I was shaking so much as I watched this strange creature with its very odd gait, dashing back and forth, seeking an escape. It was hard to follow it through the viewfinder. It was easier to just watch with my eyes. At one point, it ran to the big farm gates on the far end of the paddock and skidded to a halt on its hind legs, which I later could see the elongated hind leg skid marks and tail drag in the soft sand at the gate. Then it turned, ran to, and climbed under the ring-lock fence and loped up the hill. At the tree line it stopped and turned to look back over its shoulder, staring at Maya and I. By this point I had given up on focusing the camera or even following the erratic movement and was just watching. Then it disappeared, leaving me shattered at my inability to catch a shot in broad daylight, and Maya was so excited over what she had witnessed. Of course I was excited too, but so incredibly disappointed in myself. I imagined this was a juvenile, not quite as wise as an older animal that would have waited till dark to wander across the home paddock. It's interesting to note, though, that many sightings of thylacines are in such totally unexpected, even public spaces and in broad daylight. At times, the observer has commented that it was as if the animal was in its own little world and oblivious to human presence. My mother and sister-in-law had a sighting once on a drive inland to Kojonup, where they were attending a high school event for my niece. This was around the early 2000s. They stopped the car on a stretch of road where two thylacines were seen playing in the middle of the road. The larger one leapt over the fence into the paddock, but the smaller one, obviously a juvenile, got stuck at the fence and could not get through. My sister-in-law got out of the car and was able to walk up to the young animal. It seemed unconcerned by her approaching. She got close enough to be able to touch it, close enough to see the detail of the hair on its back, except caution in touching a wild animal stopped her doing so. It eventually found a way through the fence and ran off with its parent. Again, sadly, this was back in the day before there were phones and cameras in every hand, purse or car. The year following Maya's sighting of the thylacine in front of our house, she had another unexpected glimpse of this mysterious animal. It was Australia Day 2020, and Maya and I were on our way to her second gig of the day in Margaret River. We were on a long stretch of the Moen Road. She was driving and I was gazing out the window and ironically thinking, as I often did when passing thick bush and swampy areas with lots of scrub, how cool it would be if one day a thylacine would appear from the bush. Within half a kilometre the bush opened up to farmland and a large dairy, and I calmly observed what appeared to be a big dark brown dog loping from the dairy across the paddock near the road in the opposite direction to which we were travelling. I thought, farm dog going to bring in the cows, except at the same time the odd rocking gait prickled at the back of my mind. Simultaneously, as I was about to tell Maya to stop, she said, "That animal moves exactly like the thylacine I saw last year," and she braked and pulled over, and then tried to reverse the car along the rough gravel edges. I should have got out of the car then and there, but instead, as my camera bag was in the boot, I grabbed the phone and tried to video out the window. This was not easy, as the animal was loping well away by this time, and the car was not reversing smoothly, nor was my arm very steady out of the car window. The animal loped down through a fence and across a swampy area and up the hill behind, all cleared pasture land. Along the hill behind the dairy cows were lined up, staring, ears prickled, and watching this animal run towards them and then past them. Maya and I again watched it running away, thinking how incredibly blessed we were to witness this animal, amazed at seeing one in broad daylight, and me again, devastated that the only video I got was so shaky it was totally worthless. How I wish I could have videoed the animal when it was loping across the paddock close to the car instead of disappearing up the hill in the distance. But again, having no evidence does not take away from the fact that once again Maya and I saw it and both feel assured that these animals are still out there and alive. By the end of the last century, how cool it feels to write that, I had returned to the farm to live in the house I grew up in. This meant I was able to walk the land and the bush as my father had done before. Being a photographer and artist, I took regular hikes into the forest and along the bush tracks, being absorbed in the signs and symbols of nature, the many creations and stories that had been there all along, but I was able to quietly take my time and acknowledge them. Daily walks along what was then a solitary bush track provided me with the ability to also develop my skills in tracking and being able to read who had also shared that same track with me. It was at this time, as I was leaving my regular footprints along a certain trail, I noticed the prints of other creatures who were totally comfortable walking the same ground. Many of these I felt were most likely thylacine prints. We had no large dogs on the farm and no neighbours for miles who might have dogs. We never saw stray dogs wandering into the farm area for food or out of curiosity to our small dogs. Not ever. Having said that, my mother spoke of the 1950s when she first married Dad and moved to the farm to live. The sound of dingoes howling would terrify her at night, especially with her new in-laws leaving the house windows wide open. There have not been dingoes heard or seen here in my lifetime, though considering how well hidden thylacines have been, anything is possible. Ironically, my grandparents would speak of the dingo trappers who used to travel through the region, men who spoke of the striped dingoes that they would see or even kill. Dad also recalled a trapper who had called in to the farm and mentioned a striped dingo he had shot, which piqued Dad's interest even further. In 2011, I recall following a set of large prints along the track. They were as big as my hand, as wide as my shoe. I knew it was a large animal, as the road surface was packed down gravel and clay, not allowing prints from my own dogs when they ran along it, but these prints were embedded deep in the hard surface and remained in the road for weeks, if not months, due to the weight of the animal that had left them there. They had the wide front paw with spread toes and the narrow hind print with toes more tightly pressed together. Also obvious were the definitive long claw marks, with the mark of the fifth claw evident in some. I stepped outside the distance between the corresponding footfall and it was over 7 feet. For the first time I stood alone, miles from anywhere, only the sound of the wind meandering through the trees and the distant birds going about their business, and felt the ripple of something profound. Whoever had left these prints alongside my own was not in the least troubled by my regular presence and had no doubt been totally aware of me all along. It was happy to walk the same track as me. We shared this one path. I looked all around and sensed the recognition of a creature that I knew I had a connection to in more ways than just my father's stories. Somehow, the fears of my childhood no longer held me back. There was nothing but wonder and a deep respect. I wanted to walk with this amazing animal even more. Over the years following, I would see prints from time to time, never again such large ones, but smaller ones, and at times pairs with small prints, indicating a juvenile walking beside a parent. I began to set up trail cams along the road. It was an interesting experience. For years I captured images of foxes, rabbits, goannas and kangaroos and birds. However, the track was used by vehicles at times and my cameras were often stolen. but one morning a new camera had a fleeting image of an animal loping away off frame that caught my attention. The cheap camera was slow to trigger, so it had not caught the animal when it first appeared. It was the movement and the swinging long tail in those few seconds that looked like no other animal. A rocking kind of gait, with the creature's head swinging from side to side, scanning around as it calmly loped past. That confirmed to me what I had captured. I shared it with my brother and father, who had seen these animals in the flesh, and both acknowledged it was a thylacine. I met a ranger who worked for the government and showed him the footage. His response was that I'd captured a dog with a limp. I set more cameras along the road. One had a random capture of a creature coming out of the bush further up the road and jogging away. It had come from the direction of the farm dam, only a second or two and frustratingly grainy, but the movement and body shape was like no other animal. Around this time, I had another sighting of clear tracks from an animal running down the track, passing two of my trail cams in the process. I rushed home to view the cards to find that the animal had not triggered either of them, yet these unmistakable footprints went directly in front of both cameras. It was as if the creature had superpowers to poke fun at me and my petty attempt to invade its privacy. Around 2015, I had contact from Bernie Mace, a scientist, naturalist and environmental historian living in Victoria. He was interested in our local story about the thylacines, in particular what my father had to share about his own experiences. Bernie and I enjoyed many long discussions over the phone about this mysterious marsupial, and he organised a visit WA to meet myself and my father. Sadly, by this time, Dad was in a nursing home and his health had declined seriously. He was still sharp and had his memories and was able to chat, but got tired after talking for any length. Dad passed away not long after meeting Bernie. How I wish Bernie had met him a few years earlier. Their conversations would have been even more engaging. Bernie looked at all the evidence our family had gathered over the years, including my own footage and photos, and he camped out in the forest near our farm, eventually writing a very compelling argument for the likelihood of thylacines living today in our southwest forests. The track where I would see these footprints of the thylacines eventually became a publicly used road where it was no longer an option for me to use trail cams. Plus, I could not afford to keep losing them to theft. But I learned the pattern of these animals' movements. As Dad had shared so many of the sightings and experiences with me, I knew these animals had their chosen haunts, trails which they followed season after season, and obviously generation after generation. And this particular route led them to the swampy wetland that was a favoured habitat for hunting and hiding, providing them cover to travel unseen. From that particular wet area, a natural spring, the drains, both natural and man-made, branched out in several directions, providing cover for an animal like the thylacine to travel unseen or to find cover as they moved about the land or along roads. These included the drains alongside the main highway, but especially any drains that provided thick scrubby foliage along the banks. The network of drains coincided with the multitude of known sightings, which backed up my growing awareness of the animal using the drains to cross country. It was in these years that I met and shared many long conversations with an elder of the Pibblemum Nation, who was Kevin Cameron's nephew. He had spent a lot of time during childhood and youth beside Kevin, being taught the old ways and learning to listen to and read the land while following the ancestral songlines. Like Kevin, he held inherent knowledge and wisdom of bush law and tracking skills, and a deep spiritual connection to country and the creatures of it. He introduced me to a whole new layer of understanding of the swamp dogs, as he referred to them, or swampy, and he shared many stories of his meetings with swamp dogs, or yoggin, as the ancestors called these wild dog-like creatures. With this name, large pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The swamps and wetlands had always been their destination in the many shared sightings and pathways recorded by our family. Now I understood that the original people of this land, who would have known and lived beside these animals even more profoundly than my father, had offered the most valued affirmation to the recent story of the Slee family. These animals have always been here, and in the language of the local people, the names Yoganup here in the southwest where I live and Yokon Dog Swamp in Perth reflect as much older acknowledgement of how far back humans have been living beside these animals. I am deeply grateful for Nyimitji and his regard and trust in sharing knowledge about the swamp dogs. Speaking of swamps, the wetland and natural water resource cut a path across farm and bush to the local sighting hotspots on the highway. Unfortunately, a mining company had moved into the area, and together with the lights, noise, machinery, the human activity and disruption to the landscape, they did alter a lot of what I knew to be the Thylacine's traditional territory. Even when the mining company moved away, the fences they established were quite prohibitive to wild passage, so I knew that the pathways would be shifted. However, the natural spring where the aquifer surfaced and the wetland around it remained and is still accessible. And just as the First Nations people had their own traditional pathways, an inner map generated over centuries, so too did these marsupials have their own inherent knowledge and corridors they walked each season. It saddened me when in some years I did not notice the tracks along any of my walks, but I still hoped the animals had not been driven away from their traditional haunts. The ongoing onslaught of the native forests across the southwest, with constant logging and burning, as well as housing developments eating up both wooded areas and farmlands, added to my grave concerns for the well-being of these mysterious animals. So when I found some new prints a few years ago where my inner map of the Thylacine's pathways had led me, I was elated. They were still here, and the first prints I saw were of an adult and a young animal walking together. At this time I had stopped setting cameras. Outside the farm or on the tracks I knew to be walkways. There was now too much human traffic and cameras were stolen. But on the farm I had one major problem: the cattle. I don't know what it is about the trail cams, but the cows are drawn to them. It was almost as if they would seek them out and spend hours taking cow selfies, leaving me with a camera cards full of cows' bums, faces, and many versions of noses and tongues. Often the whole herd would camp out in front of the camera, and I would sort through tens of thousands of images of cattle, even if I had set the cameras in areas that no cattle apparently were. Also, they would knock the cameras around until they became loose and were then trampled into the dirt or mud. But I had one camera left, which I brought out to the edge of this path where I'd seen the footprints of the parent and young animal. I placed it high on a tree inside the fence and hoped this pair would return. It seemed only the young one did, or at least was the only one whose footprints I saw again, and it walked that way quite often according to the tracks I saw and photographed over the weeks following. However, it would not walk past the trail cam. The tracks would lead up to the circle of viewing, or limit of infrared at night, and then stop, and the animal's prints would veer out into the paddock and away. This happened time after time. However, the camera did capture a grainy image of the young animal standing staring for a few seconds, and it corresponded to where the prints turned then left the road. Over a few weeks I collected several such images in these same circumstances. All were of a small animal, only its shape visible in the shadows, but very obviously not a fox. The top line, the stance, the behaviour was not that of a fox or a dog, and this I knew because one constant on this camera and location were the many foxes I captured every week, and not one of them left footprints in the hard substrate, but the young animal I saw lurking in the shadows certainly did. In more recent years I still see tracks in this same location, but I've learnt that these animals sense the camera and will take an alternate path. What matters to me is that they are still alive, breeding, and roaming their traditional trails, and they feel safe to walk this one so near to my home. There is ongoing, if not random, evidence of the thylacine in life around the farm. I have no doubt about its existence, and neither does my family. We are used to it. But you cannot pinpoint when such evidence will appear, or even when the animal itself might suddenly reveal itself. It has a time frame of its own, and we can only use hindsight and observation to consider the future, and perhaps luck or fate. Sometimes you learn you are wrong. I'm willing to own that. I've spoken in the past of hearing the eerie cries of what I thought was a thylacine wandering past my house at night. Dad had spoken of the two-tone cry that was very unsettling, a sound he had heard from time to time. I thought I heard that same scream on occasions, a chilling sound, and spoke of it, assuming it was the thylacine. But I will be the first to admit when I've been wrong. A friend sent me a recording of an animal calling near where he had been camping. I thought, yes, this is what I've been hearing here at times. Played it for Dad, and he laughed and said straight away, that's a fox. So I realised that whatever my father had been describing was obviously not the same sound as I'd come to believe were from a thylacine. My noisy night wanderers were obviously just foxes. Having said that, only a few months ago, end of 2022, I heard something totally different outside my garden fence. I had tossed an old polony knob thing the crows would enjoy it, which is a type of meat. My dogs were barking late that evening, and I went outside in the dark to throw some other veggie scraps over the fence, and there was this loud rustling of something being startled and trying to get away. It gave a bizarre two-tone sound that can only be described as a cough-bark honk. At first, I thought it was a bird, but whatever was there bounded away and did not fly. And as the animal, obviously not a small one, ran, it kept making this sound, almost as if it was totally offended by me throwing stuff and disturbing it. The cry continued across the paddock in the darkness. I never saw who made that noise, but I've never forgotten such an unusual sound. Sometimes past experiences can help build a bigger picture. I know my brother has jokingly remarked that, on occasions, the sound of gunshot would draw thylacines in, as it represented a kind of dinner bell to them. On this farm, there are months when the crops are in, and the kangaroos come in great numbers, damaging fences and eating the plants, and it has been necessary to cull them. At these times, there have been a few nights of shooting kangaroos in the crop paddocks. I'm not a fan of any kind of killing, but understand the necessity and respect that well-trained marksmen will do what they do as quickly and humanely as possible. What my brother noticed one evening that reinforced his dinner bell comment was that he had shot several roos and was in the process of driving around the paddock to collect the bodies. By the time he did a lap, one adult kangaroo had been dragged quite a distance from where it had fallen. Ian sensed what had happened and drove back to the house to get his camera. When he returned, the kangaroo's head had been crushed and chewed off, and the organs had been taken out of the neck cavity. An animal had heard the guns, smelled the blood, and knew there was a fresh kill. The trademark crushing and removal of the head was a definitive sign. When he told me the next morning, I walked out there and set a camera on the fence near where the kangaroo's remains were still laying. All around its body were scuff marks, but the grass and sand was not suitable for capturing prints. I could see bits of sinew in the grass where footprints led to the boundary fence, and as I followed them through, they led across the boundary track and into the forest, following an animal trail. So intent was I on seeking any prints that might be worth photographing. Most were in deep loose sand, so were not distinctive. I walked quite far into the state forest. At one point I came across a freshly dug mound and wondered if an animal had buried something there. I examined it but could find no trace of flesh or bones. But it was at this point that I became acutely aware of what my father had described to me. Everything around me had gone silent, and the sense of being watched. I looked back the way I had come. It was further than I thought. The clearing and farm fence were just a glimmer of distant light through the shadowy bushland. I felt the prickling of hairs on my arms, and my heart beat faster. I decided to retrace my steps, but not before I looked around and quietly acknowledged, "I know you are there. It's okay. I will not hurt you." And again, I thought, what could I do to work with this animal, of its story in Australian history, the persecution, the extinction, the complete annihilation of its families and its home, all for the material reasons that only humans seem to worship. I think of the photos and grainy video clips of the last living thylacines, tragic, shaky images that tremble into my heart and still wander there, reminding me of how cruel and thoughtless humans can be, how wrong we have been time after time, how wrong we still are, and yet how easy it would be to turn things around before it's too late, like it apparently was in Tasmania back in the 1920s and 30s. I silently promised this watcher from the forest to listen, to help protect it. The bush around me so threatened and weary, as did I. This was my home too, and I had felt the ongoing destruction all around, the decline in all that made this country magnificent and healthy. I knew that we were living on the edge of total devastation of all our native forests and natural waterways. I sat, as I often do, in the heart of nature and felt the immensity of what was required, and yet the simplicity of it. It was awareness within me, such a small thing, then to share that to one other person, and then another, to show them the beauty and miracle that is nature, that is here, that is at risk if we turn our backs or choose not to care. I'm reminded that 8 of the 15 biodiversity hotspots in Australia are here in Western Australia. We have the most biologically rich yet critically threatened environments in the world. 2/3 of our plants are found nowhere else in the world, and yet since European settlement, just over 200 years, we have seen 90% of our native forests degraded or destroyed through burning, logging, clearing, or infection with disease. That's a pretty rough summary of what we have done or allowed to happen here. In my attempts to seek help for the plight of our thylacine population and the habitat it needs to survive, and goaded by the urgency of a mining lease in the forest behind our farm, where we had always known the thylacines wandered, I reached out to one of my heroes, one of the world's heroes for the environment, Sir David Attenborough. He wrote back to me by hand a letter I will treasure, in which he confessed he knew little about Australian marsupials, even though he expressed genuine interest in what I had to share. He directed me to his colleague in Australia, Professor Tim Flannery, and gave me contact details. When I contacted Tim, he said, "Sir David said I would be hearing from you, but due to busy lives and commitments, especially Tim's book and touring schedule, we sadly did not get to have that discussion face to face, and, as the mining company had been, carved up some of the lease and then departed, that urgency passed. But I intend to seek the meeting one day, because much has happened since then, in the outer destruction of our environment and in the invisible inner circles of the Thylacine." So you see, what matters to me is doing all in my power to encourage the protection of the habitat that these animals need to survive, the habitat that has sheltered and provided them protection for hundreds of years. While they are listed as extinct, nothing is done to protect them or their habitat. It's a bizarre irony that in order to protect them, we must seek acknowledgement of them being here, and to do so, sadly, must prove they are extant, shine a light on their most private existence to those who care the least, which might indeed put them at further risk. How do we reconcile the necessity for privacy and secrecy and to protect these elusive, remarkable creatures with a need to educate and inform the public and those who have the power to preserve the habitats in order to ensure these animals have a future? It's a very fine balance of respect and discretion, and choosing wisely for the greater good. At times I sit alone in the forest and ask for guidance on this. I listen to the land around me, to the stories embedded in the rocks and earth, in the trees and plants, to the whispers on the wind. Like this creature's ability to step out and in of the shadows, it's almost a mystical experience that requires something more than the traditional five senses. I have taken photos of empty roadways, but the sunlight or smoke have created a thylacine shape wandering through, looking back at me. I have looked up at the sky or taken a photo, and a thylacine has appeared in ghostly or stripy form, and it feels like I am constantly haunted, reminded of the presence of this creature, of its story. I feel a profound connection and a deep responsibility, and I try to find the answers to that question: what to do with the knowledge and awareness I have for the best possible outcome. There is one place on the farm that I go to on occasions. This, I believe, is a probable hangout for the thylacines, or a resting place on their seasonal travels. It's a swampy, wetland area, a small creek with tall trees and very thick foliage. When I stand there, the trees allow only stripes of sunlight to filter in. The frogs and birds create a symphony, but equally as commanding is the solitude, the sense of timelessness and a deeper history. This is a small pocket of nature, untouched by humans, yet holding the stories of those long ago buried deep. All throughout this site I see evidence of what my father had referred to as pampas grass. It is not pampas grass, obviously, but native rushes which form massive clumps, often towering higher than a person, with tall flower stalks that sway in the wind, very similar to pampas grass. I can see why Dad would have described it so. The wind whispers in their thick clumps, which make passage through the little valley impossible for anything but a smaller animal like a fox or a thylacine. The foliage is impenetrable, yet also protective of those allowed in. Small hollows and trails lead into hidden places. I've stood here in this location many times and sensed a prickling on my skin, a message being whispered on the wind, a recognition that something else frequents this place and has a claim to it more enduring than mine. On one occasion, I smelt a dank, earthy stench that I had not smelt before. This has been described by some who've been near a thylacine. I wondered if something very old and swampy was lingering nearby. In this place also, my terrier dogs would normally be running off exploring, sit quietly close to me and won't leave my side. A heavy sense of respect settles on them and on me. Along with the goosebumps on my skin, a knowing passes through me. I am close to something mysterious and primeval. I don't need to visit here often, nor to share it with others. I just feel the truth of an ancient animal that belongs to this land, and I honour it. And I am so grateful for this awareness and the story I have become a part of. There is an exciting conclusion to this story to date. It brings this matter full circle, a parallel between the time my father found the body of a thylacine to recent times when it has happened again. Today, as I write this, I can share that I just held in my hands the bones of a juvenile thylacine, a thylacine that was bred and born here in our southwest of Western Australia, sometime in recent history, perhaps the last 10 to 15 years. I may have laid my bare hands in the footprints of an unseen living thylacine, or watched one bounding away in the distance, but this is solid and affirming. Only those who have lived the dream of comprehensive evidence coming to light of that which we know to be true and have struggled to find genuine acknowledgement would understand the enormity of this. Yes, I got tears and wish that my father had been there to experience such a moment. 6 years ago, a Southwest resident, Chris, was with a partner at his favourite fishing spot, a river crossing near Nannup. A recent storm had blown over a large tree and when he examined the upturned roots, he spotted the bones of an animal that had sheltered beneath it in a hollow and obviously died there in the years prior to the tree falling. Initially, he found the jawbone with its unique teeth intact, and they realized it was something they'd never seen before. He and a partner came back the next day to sift carefully through the sand and nearby debris, where they collected many other bones and a curved upper tooth or fang. It was a small skeleton, and given Chris's indigenous heritage, he felt a connection that guided him to gather up the bones and take them home for safekeeping. In the years following, he was encouraged to have these bones identified by experts in the science department at the university in Perth. And so it was that he received confirmation that these were indeed the bones of a juvenile thylacine. The tiny jawbone with teeth intact was a perfect match for others held in museums in this country. Although the confirmation was in writing, the documents were lost over the last few years, but the offer of a very large sum of money to acquire these bones was compelling validation of this extremely important and valuable discovery. This information confirms one thing. According to the condition of the bones, this baby animal had died in the last 10 to 15 years, meaning that there were thylacines living and breeding in the forests here in the southwest of Western Australia at that point. This was, and is, the hard evidence that so many of us have spent a lifetime trying to find, to have confirmed. We knew it, but now those in the scientific community have seen the proof too. To Chris's credit, he declined the money that was offered to buy the skeletal remains and chose to hand them to the local Wadandi elders and custodians so they could study and preserve them and to honour this creature's existence. This little one whose life was cut short may now live on in a more powerful role, to highlight and teach some valuable truths, to represent its own story. Most importantly, it remains in the heart of the country that it originated from, something that is important for those truly connected to country. I feel deeply grateful to Chris for his sensitivity and trust, and the cultural custodians of this region for including me in this knowledge and allowing me to share this exciting information. How I wish my dad was here to celebrate this news, that at last there is validation of what he strives so hard to bring to light and have acknowledged, and maybe now, on the strength of this little creature's story, present and prospective generations of thylacines or swamp dogs will have a voice and a future. I live in hope. Wendy Slee, copyright 2023. Sincere gratitude and respect to all who have inspired, supported and encouraged me to write this, including in alphabetical order: Sir David Attenborough, Kevin Cameron, Bernard Mace, Numit G. Reagan, Chris Reynolds and Rosalind Edwards, Ian and Nolene Slee, Sid and Imelda Slee, Mayor Spilsbury Slee, Wadandi Pibalmum elders and cultural custodians of the Southwest, and Neil Waters of the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia. There you have it, folks. In Wendy's own words, the confirmation that the thylacine does exist.
So there you have it, folks. Wendy's own words in regards to this bit of physical evidence of a juvenile thylacine from WA, and a really great summary of her whole life's involvement with her father's work and her brother's work and Kevin's work, and just being on the farm and being in the area where these animals exist for so many years and still living in that area to this day, you know. So Wendy's not really interested in talking too much to the media. I think she's been through the media mill before. But she's been kind enough to allow me to publish her words here for you to have a listen to, and to appreciate the time and effort and the respect that's gone into this animal as well, especially with the Indigenous people now being the caregivers of this tiny little animal's remains. I'm quite happy to rest on that. I know that the thylacine is out there. Many other people know it's out there. Science is in a quandary over it because it seems to be bound by certain things. But either way, I think there's going to be a lot more physical evidence coming out in the near future with the amount of sightings information coming in, especially from WA. Nothing's going to stop the mining machine over there. That's still going to keep happening regardless. But we could probably do better at managing our wildlife in Australia and ban 1080 completely and utterly, because it is such a disgusting chemical to use on wildlife. It's so inhumane and very devastating right throughout the food chain. The off-target damage is horrendous. So thanks for watching, and hope you enjoyed the clip, and hopefully something more can come of this and we can actually show this evidence to you one day in the flesh. We'll see how we go. All the best. Cheers.